The Spirit of life does move within and among us, singing in our hearts, blowing in the wind, and moving in our hands. And yet there are three things that I know that are especially present to me this week as we enter the season of Lent. It is that people are afraid of death, that people die, and that people want to live meaningful lives. This, after all, is what I think draws many of us to church, to faith, and to living a spiritual life. Death is scary. It's an end, and what comes after is a mystery to us. It's evidence of our limits as human beings, and we all know that it will come someday for ourselves and our loved ones, but it's tempting to avoid truly acknowledging it. As a hospital chaplain a few years ago, I saw the lengths to which people will go to fight off death, even when it is imminent and inevitable. Many people that I cared for saw death as a failure of medicine, of their battle with disease, of life, rather than a natural conclusion of it. My journey through seminary to becoming a minister was framed by death. At moments of great personal growth and decision, I found myself confronted again and again by the truth that people die. The weekend I flew out to the West Coast to interview at seminary as a mentor back east died of brain cancer, which moved through his body so quickly that he hadn't even shared the diagnosis with everyone in his life. I didn't know. I got the news early the morning of my interviews, and I couldn't hold back tears when I told the interviewer not to expect the letter of reference that he had been in the middle of writing. The interviewer told me that it was okay to cry. I was in a good place to be processing news like this. Over the next few months, as a religious education teacher at All Souls Unitarian Church in New York, I listened to several sermons around the theme of love and death by the Reverend Forrest Church, the senior minister, who was at that time dying of esophageal cancer. During my first semester of seminary, both my academic advisor and the development director who I worked for as a student assistant also died of cancer. During my second semester of seminary, a woman who cared for my father when he was a child and who was a family member to all of us died at a very old age. A few months later, my grandmother died after a few years of declining health in a nursing home. I wasn't able to travel back for either of those funerals. A few months later, though, I did move back east, transferring to a seminary in New York, and this was one of the factors in my decision. A few years later, the day before my high-stakes interview with the Ministerial Fellowship Committee of our Unitarian Universalist Association, I found out that another family member, an Episcopal nun who had been very encouraging of my call to ministry, had died. I was far away, across the country for most of these deaths, which made them even more difficult to grapple with. I regretted being so far away, not being able to spend time with them at the end of their lives, and not being able to attend many of these funerals, opportunities to grieve together with others who loved them. But I found myself reflecting a lot on the legacy of these people, the meaning of their lives and their impact on my life. Unitarian Universalists are pretty clear that we don't know what comes after death. Does our soul go somewhere? Do we dwell in a heavenly paradise? We don't know what that experience is because none of us have been there. We do know that from dust we come and to dust we return. And so we're more focused on what we do between coming from this earth and returning to it. Even though we may not articulate it as such, I think many people come to church because they know that we come from dust, and to dust we will return someday. And they're seeking a faith and a community that will help them live a life of meaning rather than fear. Maybe this is you. These three things, the fear of dying, the reality of our mortality, and the quest for meaning, are all very present in this season of Lent. This is traditionally a time when people give up something in order to face their human limitations, and to have some clarity around that. And some take on something, a new intentional practice, in order to move toward life and toward God. It's a spiritually challenging season because it requires us to risk vulnerability and to see the opportunity present in it. My first year of seminary, when person after person in my life was dying, Reverend Forrest Church published a book of his final sermons and other reflections on love and death. I read it with great interest, and his words brought me comfort. They pointed me towards some meaning in all of this loss. He reinforced for me why religion is important. It is how we find meaning in this life. He shared his personal journey of grappling with living in the face of death, which he knew was coming soon. The refrain of Church's ministry, though, throughout his many years of ministry was, religion is our human response to the dual reality of being alive and having to die. In other words, religion is our response to us being temporary. Death is not life's goal, only life's terminus, he said. The goal is to live in such a way that our lives will prove worth dying for. The way we do this, what he focused on intensely for the final months of his life, was by giving away love. Because while our bodies perish when we die, our love will not. Only the love that we don't spend out of fear will die with us. It is not death that takes courage, he says. Love requires courage because the people we love most may die before we do. Loving them makes us vulnerable to losing all that we hold most dear. Knowing this, he challenges us to dare to love, attend to struggling relationships, get back in touch with an old friend, put yourself out there for that new job, take a chance even if you think you might be wrong. The Titanic always hits the iceberg, he says. So before it does, pick up the phone, pick up the gauntlet, do whatever it takes. Take a few chances. Dare to live before you die. Church did this in so many ways. He spent time with family and friends. He wrote and published books. He continued to preach for as long as his voice would allow him to. And he continued to minister to his community as they began grieving his death in the midst of his life. In the book Being Mortal, Atul Gawande advocates for a transformation in how our society approaches the end of life. He refers to Josiah Royce, a Harvard philosopher from the early 1900s, who wanted to understand why simply existing, why being merely housed and fed and safe and alive seems empty and meaningless. What more is it that we need in order to feel that life is worthwhile, was the question he asked. For Royce, the answer is seeing ourselves as part of something larger, something greater, and sacrificing for a cause beyond ourselves, whether it be family, country, principle, a project, or even the care of a pet. Gawande answers this question by saying that autonomy is the key to meaning. We each want to shape the story of our life in the world, to make choices and sustain connections to others according to our own priorities. All of this is risky business. By living, we risk dying. We move towards something finite and unpredictable, choosing how we will live, not knowing how it will all end. Will our efforts be cut short? But this doesn't matter, because the impact of what you've done will outlive you. This is why Reverend Church wasn't satisfied with sitting back and relaxing as his cancer took its course. He lived life so that his life would outlive him. Audre Lorde's Litany for Survival, our first reading that I shared earlier, ends with the line, "We weren't meant to survive." By this, she doesn't mean we're all going to die so nothing matters. Her words give voice to the fear that arises in many of us when faced with the finite and fleeting nature of life. When she writes, "It is better to speak remembering that we were never meant to survive," she's inviting us to embrace the dangers of living, to move toward our fear and to embrace risk, knowing that this is the only way to experience the fullness of life and love and to leave the world a better place. Over the next few weeks here in church, our Lenten series, which we are calling Risky Business, will invite you to confront the realities of finite human living and to embrace some of the risks involved: meaning-making, commitment, livelihood, reputation, and love. So my question for you today is, what are you willing to risk to live a good and meaningful life? If I said, I dare you to live, what would that look like? For me, the answer to this question goes back to that series of losses that I experienced early in my ministry. I am willing to risk making connections everywhere that this journey of life takes me. And it's taken me to a lot of different places around this country and the world in the past 17 years. I risk making connections and maintaining these connections with such an amazing, diverse group of people, knowing that I could lose them. But for now, they bring great meaning to my life. I'm willing to risk becoming a parent, bringing children into a tumultuous world. I'm willing to risk the meaningful experience of parenthood and the opportunity to have that special relationship of nurture and love. I'm willing to risk creating life that will one day end. And I'm willing to risk doing ministry. One of the things that's come from these losses I've experienced at times of big growth and decision in my ministry is an affirmation of my call. This is why I do ministry: building relationships, growing community, opening myself to something larger than me, and supporting others in doing this themselves, loving people and losing people. All of this entails risk and requires acceptance of the fleeting and finite nature of human life and human community. But I do it anyway because I believe it's important, because it makes life more meaningful for me and others, because it helps me to realize my hopes for myself and for the world. And it takes courage to shape our lives according to our hopes rather than our fears. One person who embodied this courage is another Unitarian Universalist minister, Nancy Schaefer, who died in 2012 from cancer after a challenging year of surgery and treatment. After she received the post-surgery report from the pathologist, she declared with great clarity and purpose what she had figured out about her new life and this new landscape. In an expression of hope and not fear, she decided that three things matter. First was to seek wholeness and to be who she was called to be, then more so than ever. To create and to live in beauty, and for her this was primarily about writing. She was a poet and wrote and shared poems up until about 2 weeks before her death, and her journals and poems from that year were published into a book. And third was to pay attention to relationships, to be present to people and allow them to be present to her, to hold and to be held. When she asked her surgeon about her prognosis, he said simply, "There is always enough time to love." If I focus on these, she said, I will live through this, even if I die. Those words struck me. I will live through this, even if I die. Let's live a life in such a way that we live through it, really live, and not only when faced with terminal diagnoses. All of the lives and wisdom that we've looked toward today, our readings by Audre Lorde and Mark Morrison Reed, the work of Atul Gawande, the lives and ministries of the Reverend Forrest Church and Nancy Schaefer tell us these things. We are mortal. We were never meant to survive. But don't squander this life or lose hope. Take this miraculous and precious life that you've been given and live it through loving, laughing, and savoring. This church is created around the belief that lives are best lived with meaning and purpose. And there are many ways you can seek and find that here. I think of our Aging Well workshop series and Navigating Grief class that remind us that we are mortal and help us to navigate this in our own lives and when we lose loved ones. This past week, through the ritual of the Ash Wednesday service, we were reminded that we come from dust and to dust we will return, but that it's nothing to fear. It's part of the beauty of this life. Even in our planned giving opportunities, and I'm sure the endowment committee will be so happy to hear me mention this, we acknowledge that someday we won't be here, but we want to have a say in how our resources will be used that we leave behind. And whenever we gather for a memorial service or a scattering of ashes in the memorial garden, we have the privilege of engaging in a ritual that acknowledges the hard reality of death while celebrating the gift of life. Have you ever held someone's ashes and let them slip through your fingers? The ash blows away in unexpected directions while also clinging to you, blanketing your pants, or in my case, my robe, and getting stuck under your nails. It's so symbolic. Life may slip away, but meaning remains. So what in your life will remain? You have the power to decide this if you take the risk to do so. That's what the Reverend Church and Reverend Schaefer did, and it's what we can do. We shape our story and our meaning in this life, and whenever it comes to an end, that meaning clings to the clothes and gets stuck under the nails of those we love. The message of this Lenten season is be bold, have courage, take some risks. Risk loving, risk making meaning of this life you've been given, whether you are 19 years old or 99. And remember, we were never meant to survive. From dust we come, and to dust we shall return. Let us make the most of this dust that we call our bodies and our lives. Amen.